Hello everybody, and welcome back to Chills by Angel. I hope you're all doing well today, and if you're new here, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to let you know, today's case is one that deserves to be talked about. What happened is genuinely shocking, and it didn't just impact one family, it sent ripples through an entire community and left people asking how this was ever allowed to escalate. This case centers around an Instagram livestream from August 11th, 2023, involving a fitness influencer named Nisa Hecimovic, and what unfolded next was disturbing, heartbreaking, and, in the eyes of many, tragically preventable. Before we continue, I want to give a quick heads up that this case involves domestic abuse, stalking, and unaliving, and it may be difficult for some viewers. Please take care while watching. Alright, let's get into it. Nisa Hecimovic was born on February 10th, 1988, in Bosnia. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by chaos, loss, and instability. He grew up during the Bosnian War, which alone is enough to traumatize a child. Bombings, violence, fear, uncertainty. This wasn't a normal childhood by any stretch of the imagination. And while a lot of people grow up in horrific circumstances and still manage to become kind, stable adults, sadly, that wasn't the case here. When Nisa was still very young, his mother passed away, and according to people who later knew him, this loss completely changed him. He never processed it in a healthy way. Instead, he became angry, withdrawn, and increasingly volatile. People who knew him as a child described him as having a constant rage simmering under the surface. He lashed out at others, had violent outbursts, and struggled with any kind of authority or emotional regulation. At school, he quickly developed a reputation as a bully. He was physically bigger than most of the other kids his age, and he absolutely used that to his advantage. He intimidated classmates, threatened them, and reportedly went around beating up other children, for no real reason at all, just because he could. Teachers tried to intervene. Other kids were scared of him, but nothing ever really changed. And disturbingly, the violence didn't stop at school. Reports suggest that Nisa was also aggressive at home. As he grew older and stronger, he became physically intimidating toward his own father. He would threaten him, scream at him, and allegedly even assault him. At some point, the relationship between Nisa and his father completely collapsed. They became estranged, and Nisa eventually left the family home while he was still very young. And this is important because it shows a very early pattern. He didn't respect boundaries, he didn't respect authority, and he used fear and physical dominance to control people around him. This wasn't some sudden personality shift later in life. This behavior had been building for years. By the time Nisa reached his early teens, he was already deeply troubled, already violent, and already completely disconnected from empathy for other people. And honestly, looking back now, all the warning signs were already there. By the time Nisa reached his early teens, it was painfully clear that he was heading down a dark path. He had already built a reputation for violence at school and at home, and now that aggression started spilling out into the streets. At just 15 years old, Nisa reportedly turned to a life of crime. He fell in with what people often call the wrong crowd, but honestly, that feels like an understatement. These weren't kids messing around or doing petty theft for fun. These were organized criminal groups involved in serious, large-scale crime. Nisa started out committing robberies and dealing drugs, mainly marijuana and heroin. And because he was already physically intimidating and completely fearless, he quickly proved useful to these gangs. And here's the thing, he didn't just hang around criminals, he became one. Over time, he began working for multiple different crime bosses and criminal organizations. and little by little, he worked his way up the ranks. People who later spoke about this period of his life said Nerman was known as someone you didn't mess with. If you owed money, if you crossed the wrong people, if someone wanted to scare you into compliance, Nerman was the guy they sent. He allegedly acted as an enforcer, debt collection, intimidation, violent assaults on behalf of criminal groups. Basically, he did their dirty work. And he was good at it. He was massive. He was aggressive. He had zero empathy. And he clearly enjoyed the power that came with making people afraid of him. From around 2006 to 2016, this was his entire life. He went around beating people up, collecting debts, threatening people, and still dealing drugs on the side. And the most disturbing part? He kept getting away with it. Nerman was arrested multiple times for violent assaults. We're talking serious attacks, people being hospitalized, people being left badly injured. But time and time again, the charges never stuck. Why? Because nobody wanted to testify. People were terrified of him, terrified of retaliation, terrified of the gangs behind him. So witnesses stayed silent, victims backed out, cases quietly fell apart. And every single time he walked free, it only reinforced one thing in his mind. He was untouchable. There's also one more very disturbing layer to this. In 2016, Bosnian police carried out a massive crackdown on organized crime. 3 major drug cartels were brought down. Huge quantities of drugs, weapons, and cash were seized. Nerman was arrested along with more than 20 other people. And during this investigation, police forensically searched the home of one of the crime bosses Nerman had worked for. What they found was horrifying. They discovered a room that appeared to have been used to seriously harm people. There were traces of blood. There were weapons. There were restraints. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. And given that Nerman was allegedly the enforcer for this gang, it's widely believed he may have taken part in what happened in that room. It can't be proven. There were no witnesses willing to talk. There was no physical evidence directly tying him to specific victims. But the implication alone is chilling. Even more infuriating? After all of this, all the arrests, all the violence, all the criminal connections, the possible involvement in extreme harm, Nerman still didn't go to prison. He walked free yet again. And to make matters even worse, he later bragged on social media about getting away with his crimes. Which tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't trying to change. He wasn't ashamed. He was proud. And that's what makes this chapter of his life so important. Because by the time he met Nisa, this wasn't a man who snapped. This wasn't a man who suddenly became violent. This was someone who had been violent his entire life and had learned, over and over again, that there were no real consequences. While Nerman was deeply embedded in criminal life, there was another side to him that he became completely obsessed with, and that was bodybuilding. Whenever he wasn't dealing drugs, collecting debts, or running around for criminal groups, he was at the gym, and I mean constantly. People who knew him said you could find him there pretty much every single day, sometimes for hours at a time. He lived and breathed bodybuilding. It wasn't just a hobby, it was his entire identity. He dreamed of becoming a famous bodybuilder. He started entering competitions, training even harder, and structuring his entire life around building the biggest, most extreme physique possible. And to be fair, he actually did well. He won medals. He placed high in competitions. He started gaining recognition in bodybuilding circles. But here's the uncomfortable part. Based on photos, competition footage, and later reporting, It's widely believed that Nurman was abusing steroids. And honestly, it shows. His muscles were not just big, they were unnatural. His body looked swollen, distorted, and completely out of proportion. You can still find photos of him online, and they're honestly shocking. And anyone who knows anything about steroid abuse knows what often comes with it. Mood swings, short temper, impulsivity, rage episodes, and extreme aggression. Except Nurman already had all of that. So instead of steroids creating a problem, they poured gasoline on a fire that was already raging. People who trained around him later said he became unbearable to be around. He would snap over tiny things, fly into rages for no reason, intimidate people in the gym, start arguments constantly. He became someone everyone had to walk on eggshells around. And then, in 2021, Nurman decided he wanted a full rebrand. He wanted to go from criminal enforcer to fitness influencer, which, honestly, is one hell of a career pivot. He created an Instagram account and started posting workout clips, gym selfies, competition photos, motivational captions. And it worked. His following started growing fast. Hundreds turned into thousands. Thousands turned into around 10,000 followers. He started getting sponsorships, brand deals, free supplements, paid promotions. He re-entered bodybuilding competitions and started traveling around Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and the Czech Republic. And he kept winning. Gold medals, first place finishes, more attention, more followers. He also started working as a personal trainer at his local gym, and suddenly, Nurman wasn't just some big scary guy anymore. He was a mini celebrity. People in the local area flocked to the gym just to train with him. Men wanted his physique, women wanted his attention. And yes, it absolutely went to his head. He was already egotistical, narcissistic, and power-hungry. Now he had thousands of people online praising him, telling him how amazing he looked, calling him a king, hyping him up daily. And it fed directly into his worst traits. He became more arrogant, more entitled, more controlling. He started treating people like props in his life instead of human beings. And here's the truly dangerous part. This new influencer image completely hid who he really was. To the outside world, he looked like a disciplined athlete, a successful trainer, a motivational fitness guy. But behind the scenes, he was still violent, still abusive, still deeply involved in crime, still completely unstable. And that contrast is exactly why what happened next shocked so many people. Because to his followers, Nurman didn't look like a monster. He looked like a role model. Around this time, Nurman met a woman named Nisa Hecimovic. And this is where this story takes a truly heartbreaking turn. Nisa was around 36 years old, a few years older than Nurman, and everyone who knew her described her in the exact same way. Kind, gentle, caring, and deeply family-oriented. She was incredibly close with her family. She loved her parents, her extended family, her grandparents, and she had always dreamed of one day becoming a mother and having a family of her own. People described Nisa as the kind of woman who would drop everything to help someone she cared about. She was soft-spoken, warm, and genuinely good-hearted. The complete opposite of Nurman, honestly. It's believed they met at the gym. Either she was a client of his, or she was just a regular gym-goer who crossed paths with him there. But either way, it didn't take long for Nurman to become completely fixated on her. And when I say fixated, I mean obsessed. He started following her around the gym, watching her, finding excuses to talk to her, messaging her constantly. At first, it probably felt flattering. Here's this famous local bodybuilder, this fitness influencer, this confident, charismatic guy showing interest in her. But very quickly, his attention became overwhelming. He wouldn't leave her alone. He kept pressuring her to go out with him. He kept showing up wherever she was. And eventually, Nisa agreed to go on a date with him. And from that moment on, they were officially together. At least, that's what Nisa thought. Because what she didn't know was that Nurman was a serial womanizer. He had no idea what a committed relationship even looked like. He was constantly dating multiple women at the same time, sleeping with different women, stringing them along, making each of them believe they were the only one. And tragically, he planned to do the exact same thing to Nisa. To him, she wasn't a future wife. She wasn't the love of his life. She wasn't someone he wanted to build a future with. She was just another conquest. He was bragging to his friends about her, telling them he was only with her for fun, that he didn't see a future with her, that he definitely didn't want kids or a serious relationship. Meanwhile, Nisa was in a completely different reality. She genuinely believed she was in a loving, committed relationship. She fell hard for him. She thought he was charming, protective, strong, successful. She had no idea about his criminal past, no idea about the other women, no idea about the violence. And honestly, that's the most heartbreaking part, because by all accounts, Nisa loved deeply and sincerely. She thought she had finally met her person. She thought her dream of a family and a stable future was finally coming true. And she had no idea she was getting involved with a man who would eventually destroy her life. Looking back now, knowing everything we know, it's chilling. Because this wasn't a tragic love story that went wrong. This was a predator choosing his next victim. Not long after Nurman and Nisa started dating, something happened that neither of them had planned for. Nisa fell pregnant. And this is where things take a really uncomfortable turn. Because remember, Nurman had been telling his friends that he didn't want a serious relationship. He didn't want to settle down. He didn't want kids. He didn't see a future with Nisa at all. So when she told him she was pregnant, this wasn't some joyful romantic moment for him. If anything, it was a problem. But publicly, Nurman suddenly decided to play the role of the devoted partner. He told people he was going to do the right thing, that he was going to step up, that he was going to be a family man. And on the surface, it looked like that's exactly what he did. He committed to Nisa. They got married. They moved in together. They started preparing for life as parents. In November 2022, Nisa gave birth to a baby girl. And for Nisa, this was everything she had ever dreamed of. She was over the moon. She had always wanted to be a mother, and now she finally was. Her daughter became her entire world. Nothing mattered more to her than that baby. She threw herself into motherhood. She was loving, attentive, gentle, completely devoted. But here's the horrifying part. Almost immediately after the baby was born, Nurman started to change. Or more accurately, he stopped pretending. Instead of being happy, proud, and supportive, he became jealous. Jealous of his own child. He couldn't stand that Nisa's attention was no longer fully on him. He couldn't stand that he wasn't the center of her universe anymore. He couldn't stand that her priorities had shifted. And this is where the control started creeping in. He began criticizing everything she did. How she held the baby. How she fed the baby. How much time she spent with the baby. How little attention she gave him now. He started picking fights over nothing. And then the emotional abuse began. He would insult her, belittle her, call her names, accuse her of not caring about him anymore. And then, the physical abuse started. He began assaulting her. At first, Nisa tried to hide it. She made excuses. She covered up bruises. She told herself it was just stress, that he was adjusting to fatherhood, that things would get better. But they didn't. They only got worse. He started cheating on her constantly, and not even discreetly. He was flirting with women at the gym, messaging other women online, allegedly secretly dating a woman in Germany. And when Nisa confronted him about it, he turned it around on her. He accused her of cheating, accused her of affairs, accused her of betraying him. And this is textbook abuser behavior. Deflect, deny, blame the victim. And every time he accused her of something, he used it as justification to hurt her even more. The violence escalated fast. He started hitting her regularly, punching her, kicking her, throwing her to the ground. She was constantly covered in bruises and injuries. And remember, she had just given birth. She was recovering physically. She was exhausted. She was vulnerable. And he took full advantage of that. What makes this chapter even more heartbreaking is that Nisa actually tried to get help. She reported the abuse to police multiple times, and every single time, nothing happened. No arrest, no protection order, no real intervention. She was sent back home to her abuser, over and over again. And every time that happened, Nurman learned something very important. He could hurt her and get away with it. And Nisa learned something equally devastating. No one was coming to save her. She was trapped, living with a violent, narcissistic man, raising a baby, terrified, isolated, and still hoping that maybe, somehow, he would change. By the summer of 2023, Nisa was living in a constant state of fear. The abuse had become her normal. Every day she woke up not knowing what version of Nurman she was going to get. The quiet, brooding one, or the explosive, violent one. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally. She was barely sleeping, barely eating, constantly on edge. And worst of all, she knew things were getting more dangerous. The violence was escalating. The beatings were becoming more frequent, more severe, more unpredictable. And Nurman's jealousy and paranoia was spiraling completely out of control. He was constantly accusing her of cheating, accusing her of plotting against him, accusing her of trying to leave him. Which is tragically ironic, because by this point, she actually was thinking about leaving. She was terrified for herself. But more than that, she was terrified for her baby. She started realizing something heartbreaking. If she stayed, her daughter was going to grow up watching her mother get abused. And eventually, she might become a target too. On August 3rd, 2023, everything reached a breaking point. That day, Nurman assaulted Nisa worse than he ever had before. The attack was so brutal that she could barely stand afterward. She was covered in injuries. Her body was aching. She was dizzy. She was in pain. And in that moment, something inside her finally snapped into clarity. She realized, he is going to unalive me one day if I don't leave. That night, while Nurman was asleep, Nisa made the hardest decision of her life. She packed a small bag. She picked up her 9-month-old baby girl, and she ran. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't leave a note. She didn't look back. She just got in her car and drove. She fled to her aunt's house and went into hiding. For the first time in months, She felt a tiny bit of relief, but it didn't last long. Because the very first thing Nisa did after escaping was go to the police. She begged them for help. She told them everything. The assaults, the threats, the fear, the stalking. She asked for a restraining order. She told them she was terrified of what Numan would do when he realized she had left with their baby. And she was right to be scared. The police submitted her request to the court. And then it went in front of a judge. And the judge denied it. No restraining order, no protection, no emergency measures, nothing. And I don't even have the words for how angry that makes me. Because from the outside looking in, this was a textbook high-risk domestic violence case. Escalating abuse, severe injuries, threats, a woman fleeing with her baby. And still, she was denied protection. So now Nisa was back at her aunt's house, with no legal protection whatsoever. And the worst part? The exact thing she was terrified of happened almost immediately. As soon as Numan realized that Nisa and the baby were gone, he completely lost it. He started calling her non-stop, messaging her over and over again, threatening her, blaming her, telling her she had ruined his life. And Nisa was absolutely petrified. She turned her phone off. She stayed hidden. She told only a few close family members where she was. She was living in pure survival mode. She later visited her grandmother during this time, and her grandmother said she barely recognized her. Nisa had lost a frightening amount of weight. She looked exhausted. She still had visible injuries. She told her grandmother she wasn't sleeping. She wasn't eating. She could barely function. She was convinced Numan was going to find her and unalive her. And honestly, she was right. From the moment Numan realized that Nisa had taken their baby and disappeared, his behavior went from abusive to openly predatory. This wasn't a man trying to fix his marriage. This wasn't a man worried about his family. This was a man who felt like something he owned had been taken away from him. And he was furious. He started calling Nisa non-stop, over and over again. When she didn't answer, he began flooding her phone with messages, threatening messages, rage-filled messages, manipulative messages, telling her she had destroyed his life, telling her she had no right to leave, telling her she had no right to take his child away from him. And when she still didn't respond, he escalated. He started harassing her family, calling her parents, calling her aunt, calling her cousins, calling her friends. He would ring their phones constantly, day and night. And when they didn't answer, he sent messages threatening violence, threatening to hurt them, threatening to make them pay if they didn't tell him where Nisa was. Imagine how terrifying that must have been, not just for Nisa, but for everyone who loved her. They all knew exactly what he was capable of. Nisa stayed hidden at her aunt's house, barely sleeping, jumping at every noise, convinced that any second she was going to hear a knock at the door. Or worse, the sound of it being kicked in. At one point during this time, Nisa did leave the house briefly to visit her grandmother, and her grandmother later said she was absolutely distraught. She was shaking. She was pale. She was visibly traumatized. She told her grandmother she was convinced Numan was hunting her, and the word hunting is not an exaggeration here, because he genuinely was. He was doing everything he possibly could to track her down. And this next part is one of the most disturbing things in the entire case. Numan contacted Nisa's family and told them to come collect her belongings from his house. He claimed he just wanted to give her things back. Clothes, personal items, baby supplies. and one of Nisa's family members actually went to his house to pick everything up. But what Nerman had done was secretly place a tracking device inside her belongings. His plan was simple and horrifying. Let her family bring the bags to Nisa, follow the tracker, find her location. Thankfully, and this genuinely may have saved her life for a few more days, the family member noticed the tracking device and removed it before delivering the belongings. But just think about that for a second. This man was stalking his own wife like prey, laying traps, using technology, manipulating her family. That is not normal behavior. That is obsession at a terrifying level. And then we get to one of the biggest, most chilling twists in this entire case. Because while all of this was happening, Nerman wasn't alone. He was allegedly dating another woman on the side, a woman named Janana. And according to multiple Bosnian media outlets, Janana wasn't just anyone. She was a police officer. Yes, you heard that right. The same man who openly said he hated the police, the same man who threatened police officers, the same man who assaulted a police officer in the past, was now allegedly in a relationship with one. And it gets even worse. It's widely suspected that Janana may have been feeding Nerman confidential police information, including the exact location where Nisa was hiding. Because here's the thing, the only people who officially knew Nisa was staying at her aunt's house were the police, and somehow, Nerman suddenly knew. He had her exact address, her exact location, and there has never been a satisfying explanation for how he got that information. Janana later denied that she had any romantic relationship with Nerman. She also denied leaking any information, and an internal police investigation later claimed she did nothing wrong. But I'm just going to say it. That explanation doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Because how else did he find her? It's one hell of a coincidence. And tragically, once Nerman had Nisa's location, there was nothing left stopping him. The hunt was over. He had found her. And the nightmare was about to become a reality. Friday, August 11th, 2023, the day everything finally came crashing down. By this point, Nerman knew exactly where Nisa was hiding. He knew she was at her aunt's house. And once he had that information, there was no hesitation. That morning, Nerman got into his car, completely consumed by rage. He brought a firearm with him, and he drove straight to Nisa's aunt's home. Around 10 a.m. he arrived. He started violently banging on the front door, yelling, screaming, demanding that Nisa come outside, demanding that she bring his child with her. Inside the house were 4 people: Nisa, her 9-month-old baby girl, her aunt, and her cousin. The moment they realized it was Nerman at the door, panic set in. Nisa immediately grabbed her baby and ran to a bedroom. She locked the door. She pushed furniture in front of it. She tried to barricade herself inside. She knew exactly what he was capable of. Her cousin, meanwhile, made the heartbreaking decision to open the door. He was trying to reason with Nerman, trying to calm him down, trying to de-escalate the situation. But there was no reasoning with this man. The moment the door opened, Nerman pulled out the firearm, and he fired. He shot Nisa's cousin multiple times in the legs. The cousin collapsed to the floor, screaming in pain, bleeding heavily. And in that moment, everything spiraled into pure chaos. Nisa's aunt ran toward her son, hysterical. Her child had just been shot in front of her. She had no idea if he was going to survive. She started begging Nerman to stop, begging him to leave them alone. But he ignored her completely. He pointed the firearm at her. She tried to throw herself in front of the bedroom door to protect Nisa and the baby, and he shoved her out of the way like she was nothing. Then he went for the bedroom. He started kicking the door, over and over again, until it finally broke open. Inside that bedroom was Nisa, terrified, sobbing, clutching her baby. Norman forced his way in. The first thing he did was grab the baby out of Nisa's arms. He took his 9-month-old daughter outside and put her in his car. Nisa was screaming, begging him not to take her baby. And then he came back for Nisa. He grabbed her by the hair, dragged her through the house, dragged her outside. As he was dragging her toward the car, Nisa was screaming at the top of her lungs for help. "Help me! Help me!" She was trying to get the attention of anyone in the neighborhood, anyone at all. But nobody came in time. Norman started hitting her in public, with his fists, throwing her around like she was nothing. And then he shoved her into the car. Their baby was in the back seat. Nisa was in the front, bleeding, injured, terrified beyond words. And then he drove off, leaving behind a scene that looked like a war zone. Nisa's aunt was left standing there in total shock. Her son was lying on the floor, bleeding heavily from multiple gunshot wounds. She had just watched her niece get abducted. She had just watched her granddaughter get taken. And she had no idea if she would ever see either of them alive again. Police were called immediately. But here's the part that makes my blood boil. They didn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. In a situation involving a firearm, multiple people being shot, a violent abduction, a known dangerous suspect. By the time police finally got there, Norman was long gone. Thankfully, paramedics managed to save the cousin's life. But Nisa? She had vanished. And no one had any idea where Norman had taken her. From that moment on, this was no longer just a domestic violence case. It was a full-scale manhunt. And tragically, the worst was still yet to come. After abducting Nisa from her aunt's house, Norman drove her to a remote, abandoned cottage outside the city. It was a place he knew well, a place that belonged to someone he knew, a place he was confident no one would randomly show up at. And that's exactly why he chose it. As soon as they arrived, he dragged Nisa out of the car and threw her onto the concrete porch outside the cottage. She was already badly injured from what had happened at the house. She could barely stand. She could barely breathe. She was dizzy, disoriented, and in excruciating pain. And instead of stopping, he assaulted her again. He struck her with his fists. He struck her with the butt of the firearm. Eventually, Nisa collapsed onto the ground. She physically could not get back up. Her face was swollen beyond recognition. Her jaw was broken. Her entire body was bruised and battered. And then, he did something that makes this whole thing even more unthinkable. He went back to his car, took their 9-month-old baby girl, and placed her on the ground next to her mother. That baby was crying at the top of her lungs, and Nisa was lying there on the concrete, barely conscious, unable to move, unable to comfort her child. And that's when Norman pulled out his phone. He opened Instagram, and he pressed Go Live. At first, only a few people joined, then dozens, then hundreds. Because remember, he had around 10,000 followers. People followed him for fitness content, workouts, motivation, bodybuilding. So when they saw him go live, most of them probably thought, "Oh, he's doing a workout. Oh, he's ranting about something. Oh, he's just going live like influencers do." But within seconds, it was painfully clear that something was very, very wrong. The live stream showed blood on the ground. It showed the abandoned cottage. It showed a firearm on a table. And then he turned the camera toward Nisa. She was sitting slumped over on a bench, her head hanging forward, barely able to hold herself upright. Her face was completely swollen and bruised. Both of her eyes were blackened. Her lips were swollen. Her jaw was visibly broken. And honestly, I came across the beginning of this live stream while researching this case, and I wish I hadn't. I'm not going to describe everything I saw, because nobody should be hunting this video down. What matters is this. It was immediately obvious that this woman had been brutally assaulted and was in life-threatening condition. Nurman zoomed the camera in on her face. He started humiliating her, insulting her, blaming her for everything, calling her names. At this point, hundreds of people were watching, and they had no idea what they were witnessing. They thought they were watching some unhinged influencer meltdown, but they were actually watching a real human being being held hostage by her abuser. Nurman then turned the camera on himself and addressed the audience, and this is where things became truly chilling. He told his viewers that he was about to unalive her live on camera. He said it casually, like he was announcing a workout set, like he was joking. And I genuinely don't even have words for how surreal that is. He then turned the camera back toward Nisa. He demanded to know why she had reported him to the police, why she had ruined his life. And even in the condition she was in, barely able to speak, barely conscious, Nisa answered him. She said she had gone to the police because she was terrified of him, because she feared for her life, and because she was afraid for her baby. And that should have been the moment that snapped him back into reality. But instead, it made him angrier. Meanwhile, in the background of the live stream, you could hear their baby crying, screaming. And there was nothing Nisa could do. She physically couldn't get up. She couldn't reach her baby. She couldn't protect her. And that part honestly destroys me, because that poor little girl was witnessing this entire nightmare. At this point, viewers in the live stream started panicking. Some people were begging him to stop, telling him to calm down, telling him not to hurt her, telling him to think about his child. And then, because the internet is the internet, some people were egging him on, encouraging him, calling him a king, telling him to do it. And I will never understand that. I don't care how dark or edgy someone thinks they are. Encouraging real-world violence against another human being is beyond sick. As more people joined the live stream, it started spreading through the Instagram algorithm. Hundreds turned into thousands, and tragically, some of Nisa's own family members and friends were now watching this unfold in real time. They had no idea where she was. They didn't recognize the location. They couldn't get to her. All they could do was call the police and watch in horror. And then, the worst happened. Nurman picked up the firearm. He turned back to the camera, and he told the audience to watch closely. And then, he unalived Nisa. Live, on Instagram, in front of thousands of people. You could hear the shot. You could see her body collapse. And just like that, 38-year-old Nisa Hecimovic was gone. I genuinely don't have words. The cruelty of this, the performative nature of it, the fact that he turned her death into content, it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever come across in a true crime case. And as if that wasn't enough, he then pointed the camera at their baby girl. She was lying on the concrete floor, still crying, surrounded by her mother's blood, and he said something along the lines of, "Someone come and get the baby. I'm done." And I actually had to pause my research at that point. Because what do you even do with that information? He had just unalived his wife in front of their child. And now he was essentially abandoning his baby on the internet to strangers. And then he got into his car. He drove away. And he ended the live stream, leaving behind a dead woman, a screaming baby, and thousands of traumatized viewers. After unaliving Nisa and abandoning their baby at the cottage, Numan got back into his car and drove off. And this is the part that makes everything even more disturbing. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't trying to hide. He wasn't panicking. He was hunting for more victims. He knew the police would be coming for him. He knew his days were numbered. And instead of stopping, he decided he was going to take as many people down with him as he possibly could. Not long after leaving the cottage, Numan went back on Instagram. He made another post. And in it, he openly said that he was going to track down and unalive more of his enemies. Like this was some kind of mission. Like this was a game. He then started driving toward the city centre at high speed, and one of the people he had in his sights was a young man named Dennis. Now, Dennis had done absolutely nothing wrong. The only reason Numan had a grudge against him was because he had previously dated Dennis's sister. During that relationship, Numan had reportedly stolen around 50,000 euros from her. Yes, he stole her money. And her family later tried to take legal action to get it back. So somehow, in Numan's completely warped mind, that made them the villains. He blamed Dennis and his family for ruining his life, even though he was the one who stole from them in the first place. So Numan started calling Dennis repeatedly, over and over again. Dennis didn't answer, but Numan managed to track his location. It turned out Dennis was sitting in his Volvo, parked outside a kebab shop in the city centre. Numan drove straight there. He pulled up next to Dennis's car, and without saying a word, he fired multiple shots through the windshield. Dennis was hit and instantly unalived. He was only 23 years old. And what makes this even more heartbreaking, Dennis's parents were inside the kebab shop at the time. They heard the shots. They rushed outside. Because they knew their son was out there. They thought he'd been in an accident. They thought maybe someone needed help. They had no idea what they were about to walk into. When they came outside and saw their son's car, Numan was still there, and instead of stopping, he turned the firearm on them. He fired at Dennis's mother, hitting her in the chest. She collapsed to the ground, bleeding heavily. Miraculously, she would later survive her injuries, but then he fired at Dennis's father. He was hit multiple times, and tragically, Dennis's father did not survive. So in the span of just minutes, Numan had now unalived Nisa, Dennis, and Dennis's father. 3 completely innocent people, 3 families destroyed. And the violence still wasn't over. Police were now desperately trying to track him down. Multiple emergency calls were coming in about an armed man driving through the city, and at one point, a police car actually pulled up next to Numan's vehicle. Instead of surrendering, Numan opened fire on the police officer. The officer was hit and collapsed to the ground. Thankfully, the officer would later survive, but at this point, this had turned into a full-scale active shooter situation. Numan then sped off again, and unbelievably, he drove straight to a hunting and outdoor supply store. He walked inside, covered in blood, holding a firearm, and demanded more ammunition. He told the shop owner to give him bullets immediately. Now, this shop owner deserves serious credit, because in that moment, he realized exactly what was happening. He realized this man was on a violent rampage, and if he gave him real ammunition, more people were going to die. So thinking incredibly fast under pressure, the shop owner handed Nurman a box of fake ammunition, training rounds, completely useless, and he prayed that Nurman wouldn't notice. Nurman took the box, didn't check it, and walked back out of the store. The shop owner later armed himself, fully expecting Nurman to realize the bullets were fake and come back to unalive him. But thankfully, that never happened. Nurman got back into his car and drove off again, believing he was now fully reloaded, and that he could keep going. And what makes this even more chilling is that he went live on Instagram again, ranting, raving, bragging. He told his viewers that he had unalived 2 more people, a father and a son. He said his baby was safe. He said Nisa had hidden the child from him, that she had reported him to police, that he had to unalive her. He also bragged about shooting a police officer, and then he said something that still gives me chills. He told his audience that these weren't even his first unalivings, that he just didn't talk about the others much. And if that's true, it means Nisa, Dennis, and Dennis's father may not have been his first victims, which is absolutely terrifying. He ended that live stream by saying, "There are still more people I need to unalive. I'm signing off now." And by this point, the entire city was in lockdown mode. His face was all over the news. Police were warning people to stay inside, to lock their doors, to not open up for anyone. And somehow, he was still out there, still armed, still free, and still determined to hurt more people. After leaving the hunting shop with what he thought was a fresh supply of ammunition, Nurman got back into his car and sped off through the city. He truly believed he was fully reloaded. He believed he could keep going. And that's the most chilling part of all of this. Because if that shop owner hadn't handed him fake rounds, there is no doubt in my mind that more innocent people would have lost their lives that day. By this point, the entire city was in a state of panic. Emergency calls were flooding in. People were being warned to stay inside, lock their doors, not open up for anyone, avoid the city centre. Nurman's face was everywhere. News channels, social media, emergency alerts. Police were desperately trying to track his location in real time. Meanwhile, Nurman went live on Instagram yet again, and honestly, this second live stream is just as disturbing as the first. He was ranting and raving, talking about how he had unalived 2 more people, a father and a son. He said his baby was safe. He said Nisa had hidden the child from him, that she had reported him to the police, and that he had to unalive her because of it. Which is absolute nonsense, by the way. That is the language of an abuser trying to justify the unjustifiable. He also bragged about shooting a police officer, and then he said something that sent chills down people's spines. He told his audience that these weren't even his first unalivings, that he just didn't talk about the others very much. And if that's true, it strongly suggests that what he did to Nisa, Dennis, and Dennis's father may not have been the first time he had taken someone's life, which is absolutely terrifying. He ended that live stream by saying, "There are still more people I need to unalive. I'm signing off now." And then the live ended. At this point, police finally managed to locate him. It was now just after 1 p.m., nearly 3 hours after he had unalived Nisa on Instagram Live. Nurman had driven to an abandoned farm just outside the city. He parked his car and hid behind large pieces of farm machinery. He knew police were closing in. He knew there was no real way out of this. But in his mind, he was planning one final stand. He took out what he believed was all of his remaining ammunition. He started preparing to shoot at police officers when they arrived. Because remember, he had always said he hated the police. He had always talked about wanting to hurt them. So in his twisted mind, this was going to be his last act, a violent shootout, taking as many officers with him as possible. But then, reality finally caught up with him. He tried to reload his firearm, and it didn't work. He tried again, and again, and again. And that's when he realized something was very, very wrong. The ammunition was fake. Every single round he had been given at the shop was useless. He now only had 3 real bullets left. And in that moment, he knew. It was over. There would be no shootout. There would be no final stand. He was cornered, surrounded, out of options. Police were closing in on the farm from multiple directions, and for the first time that entire day, Norman was powerless. And instead of surrendering, he turned the firearm on himself, and he took his own life. And just like that, the rampage finally ended. After everything that had happened that day, after 3 innocent people had been unalived, after an entire city had been terrorized, it was over. But the damage had already been done. In the hours and days that followed, the public reaction was massive. News coverage ran non-stop. People across Bosnia were in shock. And as more details came out, the outrage only grew. It was revealed that Nisa had reported Norman to police multiple times for abuse, that she had begged for help, that she had tried to get a restraining order, and that a judge had denied it. When people found that out, they lost their minds. Thousands of people took to the streets in protest. They were protesting against domestic violence, against the lack of protection for abused women. The authorities announced that they would try to identify and prosecute the people who had encouraged Norman during the live stream, the people who had egged him on, the people who had told him to do it. I don't know what came of that, but the fact those comments even existed in the first place is sickening. And that's where this case ends, with 3 innocent people dead, a baby girl left without her mother, multiple families destroyed, and a whole country asking how this was ever allowed to happen. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I know this was a heavy one, and I truly appreciate you being here and taking the time to hear Nisa's story. If this case affected you in any way, please take a moment for yourself. Stories like this can stay with you, and that's completely normal. And I do want to say this: if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, you are not alone, and you are not overreacting. Abuse isn't always physical. Control, fear, threats, and emotional harm are abuse too. I've added domestic abuse helpline information for the UK in the description of this video. If you're in the UK, please consider reaching out to them for confidential advice and support. And if you're not in the UK, I encourage you to look up a local support service in your country. If you found this video informative, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like. You can also share this video if you feel this story deserves to be heard. And if you're not already following or subscribed to the channel, I'd love to have you here for future cases. Most importantly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case in the comments. Thank you again for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye, guys.